Right now, in a stretch of white desert in southern New Mexico, there is a set of footprints that shouldn't exist. They were left by a child. Small, bare feet, pressed into soft mud on the shore of a lake that dried up long before the first city was ever built. And when scientists finally put a date on those footprints, the number came back so wrong, so far outside what we were told was possible, that some of the most respected researchers in America spent years trying to prove it couldn't be true. Because if that child really walked here when the evidence says they did, then the story we were all taught about who reached this continent first and when is off by 7,000 years. This is what the official timeline of the Americas can't explain. That child has become one of the most dangerous discoveries in modern American archaeology, and the ground that holds the trail only deepens the strangeness. White Sands National Park sits in the Tularosa Basin, a wide, silent bowl of land ringed by mountains. The ground here isn't sand. It's gypsum, fine and blindingly white, the dried remains of an ancient sea, drifting into dunes that can swallow a footprint in a single afternoon. Most of the basin is closed off because the U.S. Army uses the land right next door as a missile range. It's one of the hardest places in the country to reach, and one of the last places anyone expected to rewrite human history. Everything in this video was cross-referenced against the journal Science, the U.S. Geological Survey, the National Park Service, and the Bournemouth University team that dug the site. So we're working from the record, not rumor. And it wasn't found all at once. For decades, people at White Sands had noticed faint marks out on the flats that came and went with the weather. The staff called them ghost tracks because most of the time they're invisible, blended into the white ground, and they only rise into view under exactly the right moisture, then sink out of sight again. Nobody knew how old they were. Around 2009, researchers started to realize some of those tracks were human, lying in the same ground as extinct Ice Age animals. It wasn't until 2019 that a team led by Matthew Bennett, a scientist from Bournemouth University in England, worked with the National Park Service to cut a proper trench into the old lakebed and dig the prints out, layer by layer. What they pulled from the ground wasn't bones or tools. It was footprints. 61 of them, from 8 separate bands of buried mud, left by as many as 16 different people. And what the prints showed was strangely intimate. Most of them belonged to teenagers and children, kids between about 9 and 14 years old, moving back and forth across the wet shore, while the adults, it seems, did the skilled work at the water's edge. The only question left was the one that would tear the whole field apart. How old were they? Dating footprints is almost impossible because a footprint is a hole. It's an absence. It holds nothing you can put under a machine and measure. But the team caught a break in the mud itself, running through the layers, above the prints and below them, and in some cases pressed right inside them, were the seeds of an underwater plant called spiral ditch grass. Seeds are organic, and organic material can be radiocarbon dated, so the researchers gathered the seeds from the layers that bracketed the trackways and sent them off to be measured. The answer came back between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. Read that again, because the researchers did, several times. These weren't a few centuries old. The trackways spanned nearly 2,000 years of people returning to the same lakeshore, and the youngest of them was already older than farming, older than the pyramids, older than writing itself. To feel how strange that is, picture the world these kids were walking through. 23,000 years ago was the depth of the last ice age. Sheets of ice more than a mile thick sat on top of Canada and pushed down into the northern United States. So much of the ocean was frozen into those sheets that the sea sat hundreds of feet lower than today, and the coastlines of the world were far out past where the beaches are now. It was a frozen, brutal planet. And on a lakeshore in New Mexico, barefoot children were leaving prints in the mud. In 2021, the team published all of this in Science, one of the most respected journals on Earth. And that's the moment a quiet study of some footprints turned into a war over the entire history of this continent. Because the number they'd just printed wasn't supposed to be possible. For most of the last century, the story of how people reached the Americas was settled, and it had a name: Clovis. It comes from a town in New Mexico, not far from White Sands, where in the 1930s archaeologists found distinctive stone spear points buried alongside the bones of Ice Age animals. Those points turned up all across North America, and for decades they were treated as the calling card of the first Americans, a people who arrived around 13,000 years ago. The textbook version went like this. During the Ice Age, so much water was locked into ice that the sea dropped, and a land bridge opened between Siberia and Alaska. People walked across, waited for a corridor to melt open between two enormous ice sheets, and then spread south into an empty continent. First arrivals, about 13,000 years ago. And for a long time, if you claimed anything older, your career paid for it. Sites that seemed to show earlier people were picked apart, doubted, and quietly shelved. The rule was simple. Nothing came before Clovis. That wall had cracked once before, and it's worth knowing how, because it shows you how bitter this fight gets. Down in southern Chile, a site called Monte Verde, dug by an archaeologist named Tom Dillahay, kept producing dates around 14,500 years, more than 1,000 years before Clovis. For years, the field refused to accept it, until in 1997, a group of leading archaeologists traveled to the site, saw it with their own eyes, and finally admitted it was real. That single visit pushed the first Americans back past Clovis and broke the rule. And just so you know how unsettled all of this still is, Monte Verde's own age is being refought right now. A 2026 study argued it's actually far younger than everyone believed, and around 30 other researchers fired back within weeks, calling that reanalysis a serious mistake. This is a field that argues about everything. Monte Verde moved the line by 1,000 years. White Sands was about to move it by 7,000. So look again at what the footprints were claiming. Humans standing in the middle of North America 7,000 to 10,000 years before Clovis, during the coldest, harshest stretch of the whole Ice Age, at a moment when the inland routes were supposedly sealed shut behind walls of ice. If the date held, the tidy land bridge timeline was finished, and a lot of serious people had spent their whole lives building the version the footprints were about to overturn. So they did what scientists are supposed to do. They attacked. The first thing you'd try, if you wanted to kill the date, is to argue the footprints were left more recently, that younger tracks somehow ended up looking ancient. But the lakebed had already slammed that door shut. Pressed into the very same layers, mixed right in with the human trails, were the tracks of animals that have been extinct for over 10,000 years. The wide, round pads of a Columbian mammoth, the shuffling marks of a giant ground sloth the size of a car, dire wolves, camels, saber-toothed cats, even the American lion. You can't fake that. And in places, the two worlds touch. There are human footprints pressed inside the tracks of a giant ground sloth, following it, circling it, the way you'd move if you were stalking something you meant to kill. There are small prints left where children splashed in sloth tracks that were already filling with water. And in one place, the longest fossil human trackway ever found, more than a mile of it, records a young woman, or maybe a teenager, carrying a small child on her hip. setting the child down now and then. And on the walk back, a mammoth and a giant sloth had crossed the path between her outbound and return steps. All of that is written into the ground. It's the record of a single day, and the animals pin that day deep in the Ice Age, whether the establishment likes it or not. So the critics couldn't drag the footprints forward in time. Instead, they went after the one soft spot in the whole discovery: the seeds. Here's where the science gets sharp, and where we have to be honest, because the doubters weren't cranks. They were some of the most decorated names in the field, and their objection came down to one real problem: the hard water effect. Spiral ditchgrass is an underwater plant. It builds its body out of carbon dissolved in the lake water, and in a basin like this one, that water can carry very old carbon leaking out of ancient limestone. If the plant soaked up carbon that was already thousands of years old, then the seeds would test as far older than the day the plant actually grew, which would make the footprints much younger. A geologist named Vance Haynes went first, arguing in print that the tracks might really be Clovis age, around 13,000 years. Then a group of researchers, David Madsen, David Rode, and their colleagues, pressed the seed problem harder, laying out how the ditchgrass dates could be pushed too old. And on paper, it landed. If the only thing standing between 13,000 years and 23,000 years was a handful of underwater seeds, then the whole rewrite of American history was resting on the weakest possible material. But when you followed their alternative all the way through, it started to strain. To make the footprints Clovis age, you needed those seeds to be dug up out of much older ground, carried across the basin, and then dropped in neat layers exactly where 13,000-year-old people would later happen to walk. The team behind the discovery called that chain of events highly unlikely, if not impossible. If a set of footprints being able to knock 7,000 years off the human story is the kind of thing you want more of, take 1 second to subscribe, because we chase exactly these buried arguments every week. Now here's where it turns, because the team heard the objection, and instead of just defending the seeds, they went looking for a way to date the site without the seeds at all. If the ditchgrass was the weak link, the answer was to throw it out and date something the hard water effect could not touch. So that's what they did. In 2023, a team including scientists from the U.S. Geological Survey went back to the same layers and pulled 2 completely different clocks out of the ground. The first was pollen, but not just any pollen. They isolated the pollen of conifer trees, mostly pine, gathering nearly 75,000 grains in a single sample. Pine grows on dry land, in open air, nowhere near the old carbon in the lake, so its radiocarbon date comes back clean. The second clock did not use carbon at all. It measured how long grains of quartz had been buried in the dark, sealed away from sunlight. 2 clocks, running on completely different physics, both immune to the objection everyone had raised. Both landed in the same window, 21,000 to 23,000 years. The seeds had been telling the truth the whole time. That should have ended it. It didn't, quite. So in 2025, the researchers took a third swing, led this time by Vance Holliday from the University of Arizona. They dated the ancient mud of the lakebed itself and sent it to 2 independent labs to keep the result at arm's length. The mud gave the same answer as the seeds, and the pollen, and the quartz. By Holliday's own count, there are now 55 separately dated samples, seeds and pollen and mud together, all pointing at the same age. As he put it, it would take serendipity in the extreme for every one of those dates to be wrong in exactly the same direction. The footprints really were carved into the depths of the Ice Age, and the harder anyone pushed, the more stubbornly the date held its ground. And even now, it isn't fully closed, and this is the part most videos leave out. One of the field's most respected voices, an archaeologist named Michael Waters from Texas A&M, still isn't convinced. His concern is aimed squarely at that last method, the mud. He's pointed out that bulk lake sediment can hold its own old carbon, and that it isn't always clear where the dated carbon actually came from. So until that's pinned down, he's holding on to his doubt. That doubt deserves respect. It's science doing its job and holding the line, because certainty that comes too easily is usually the thing that turns out to be wrong. But step back from the fight over carbon and decimal points, and a much bigger question is standing right there, and nobody can answer it. Careful scientists won't even call these the first Americans, because there may have been earlier people who left no trace we've found yet. What they will say is that this is the oldest, securely dated evidence of humans anywhere in the Americas. So who were they? They were here thousands of years before the land bridge could have let anyone through during the peak of the Ice Age, when the inland corridor was still choked with ice, which means they may have come a completely different way. The leading idea is the coastal route, sometimes called the Kelp Highway, the theory that the first people didn't march overland at all, but moved down the Pacific shoreline in small boats, living off the sea, hopping from one patch of coast to the next, while the interior stayed frozen and impassable. If that's right, the oldest sites of all aren't in the desert. They're drowned, sitting hundreds of feet underwater, out past the modern beaches, on coastlines that flooded when the ice melted. We may never reach them, so the one kind of evidence that could settle this for good may already be lost, which is exactly why a trail of footprints in a desert is carrying the whole weight of it. And that leaves us with almost nothing about these people. Stop and picture them for a second. A handful of kids, barefoot, at the edge of a cold lake, 23,000 years ago. These weren't warriors or a myth or a line in some journal. They were children on an ordinary afternoon, doing what children have always done near water. They had no idea they were the oldest known people on 2 entire continents. They had no idea the mud they were standing in would outlast their whole world, their language, and their names, then surface again long enough to break the story. Every one of us was taught in school. We don't have their bones. We don't have their tools. We don't know what language they spoke, or where they came from, or what became of them. All we have is the one thing they couldn't take back. The footprints are still out there tonight, in the Tularosa Basin, under the white gypsum, buried and uncovered again and again by the wind that never stops moving across the flats. The child who left them will never have a name. The people who fought the date will keep fighting at the edges, and maybe one loophole will still close. But dozens of dates across 3 different materials have already done the damage. The map of how humans reached this continent, the one printed in every classroom, was drawn from bones and stone points and careful guesses. It never once accounted for a set of small, bare feet in the mud of a dried Ice Age lake. And if a few footprints can rewrite 13,000 years of history, wait until you see what scientists just pulled out of the ice on the other side of the world.